Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and this is the Keto Made Simple podcast.
Hi, everyone. Dr. Eric Westman here, and welcome back. Time to time, I get to interview the movers and shakers in the keto world. It's my great pleasure to have Dr. Andrew Koutnik with me today.
Glad to be here, Dr. Westman. If many people in the audience don't know, you've done quite a bit for the field that I'm in. Have quite a legacy in this, so it's an honor to get to speak with you today.
Well, my pleasure, because you're in the midst of learning what ketones are, what ketones do, and I just tell people to stop eating carbs and have the wonders of ketones. So anyway, it's my great pleasure. And so who are you? Where are you from? How'd you get into this world? And what's on your mind latest now today?
Yeah. So, Dr. Westman, for those in the audience who aren't familiar, I'm a research scientist studying the impact of lifestyle with a strong focus on nutrition, on diabetes or those at risk for diabetes. And we have a health and performance-based mindset, trying to understand and uncover how these nutritional strategies work, and then how the unique effects it has on metabolism, and the metabolites themselves can actually translate to meaningful, actionable change in patients. And so that's where I'm at right now. But I actually started my journey on a personal level with obesity. So I had obesity in adolescence as a kid, and very much appreciated the struggles and the difficulties that come along with being in the current food environment, and kind of Western culture and its impact and risk for obesity. But I actually, after years and years of failing, Dr. Westman, I know you've helped many people on their journey to weight loss. I finally was successful. I didn't do anything particularly novel. I just had some accountability, and it was very, very hard. It wasn't easy. I probably could have done it a better way now with the knowledge I have today, but at that time I didn't. But I eventually did lose weight, and I amazingly, a year later, get diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And that diagnosis was revolutionary to me, not only on my personal life, but on my career. It completely changed my interest in how food and lifestyle interacted with my body composition. To now it took it to, at every single meal, I was seeing the direct impact of food on not only glucose levels and insulin, but how I felt in a very short period of time after food. And I could start drawing associations between glucose, insulin, and these other components of lifestyle. But that really changed my complete path in life, Eric, to ultimately going into research, not just to study. I always found science fascinating, getting real answers to questions, and was such an interesting and intellectually stimulating path. Yeah. But what I was so fascinated in, Eric, was the translation of that to real meaningful outcomes. I had lived the experience myself, and knew how powerful things like nutrition and exercise could be to how you feel. And that took a level of awareness with type 1 diabetes that it was hard to compare with anything else in my life. So I went.
How old were you? How old were you when you had the diagnosis?
Yeah, so I wasn't officially diagnosed, but when I was 12, a little after 12, I was coming up on overweight and obesity. I was definitely officially obese in late adolescence. And then my diagnosis with type 1 diabetes was 16 going on 17. So back in 2006, June 2006, actually.
Okay.
And so it's been almost 17 years, somewhere around there, creeping up around those numbers. I always forget at this stage.
I'm sure you remember back. Well, how did you know something was wrong? How did you get diagnosed with type 1?
Actually on a family trip. I was on my way to go to Washington, D.C. with our family. I was in high school at the time, just finished my, depending on where you are in the world, it was my second to last year before I would go off to college, or at least maybe go to college. I didn't know at that stage what I was going to do. But we were in summer, in this between school periods, and we went on a trip to Washington, D.C. to actually see what I was learning about in school. I became very fascinated with learning at that stage, and actually education. So luckily as a kid, not everyone does, but I did at that stage, a major pivot actually. And I felt and my stomach started to hurt right before we got on the flight. I started to get nauseous, and I made the mistake, Eric, of thinking, oh, wow, bread and sugary drinks are going to help make my stomach feel better. You know, the old wives' tale, like
generally, and they do. Yeah. Oh, no.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I did not realize that my body was quickly losing the ability to actually metabolize glucose and carbohydrates. And I was rapidly consuming them thinking I was going to help my situation, but I didn't know, right? I was unaware of the internal devastation and kind of attack on my own cells that my body was taking place, or that was taking place in my body. And it was actually about 24 hours later when we got to DC and we started walking around, because in DC there's a lot of opportunities to walk around and see different sites. And I've never felt more exhausted in my entire life, and not realizing that was because I was not able to actually take any of the food I was consuming and actually put it in as energy, and the what was the complete or near absence of insulin in the body. And I felt horrible. That night I drank, it was either 14 to 16 of the typical glasses of water, 16 ounces. I forget the exact amount, but I was drinking them one after the other. And I was urinating at excessive levels. And it obviously wasn't feeling good. I was very fatigued. And then the next night we did the same thing, but they brought out pitchers, like the actual pitcher they pour at each table. I drank 2.5 of those. And that night I threw up for 14 hours straight and ended up in the hospital. My mouth felt like cardboard because I'd been throwing up for so long. I've never been so dehydrated in my entire life. And luckily we were thinking, okay, they're just super sick, but it got to dangerous levels of dehydration, dangerous levels of, I wasn't able to consume anything for hours and hours, almost over half a day at this point, and was vomiting up everything in me. And so we ended up, my mom called my grandmother, who was actually a nurse at the time, and says, you need to take him to the hospitals right now. So we go to the hospital, and my blood sugar, for those in the audience, they're probably very familiar because, if they're part of your community, they probably get this, but normal being 70 to 120 milligrams per deciliter, and whatever's optimal within that is up for debate, but that's what is medically defined as normal glycemia. And for those outside of the United States, that's around 4.5 to 6.67 millimoles. I was 596, so about 6 times higher than normal. And they walk in the room and say, look, Andrew, you have type 1 diabetes and you're going to have it for the rest of your life. And I was like, I have no idea what this means. Can I get out of the hospital? But over the next 2 weeks, they rapidly take you into a complete face-first plunge into understanding that everything you eat for the rest of your life, you're going to be your own master dictator of metabolism. You will now control everything you're consuming. You will need to know everything about it. And not only that, you're going to have to understand how much insulin you're going to need to give to control your blood sugar levels. And I wasn't completely educated on this at the time, Dr. Westman, but what I soon found out was that they tell you want to keep your blood sugar levels as controlled as possible. Well, as a researcher now studying and have for years type 1 diabetes and the impact nutrition and other lifestyle factors can have on it, glucose levels are the key risk factor of how not only you feel right here, right now, today, but the long-term complications that will be associated with the disease if you're not able to control it. And unfortunately, the vast majority of people are not able to control it. In fact, 99% of people with my disease, Dr. Westman, do not have what's termed normal metabolic glycemic control. And so they live their entire life outside of normal. And it has pretty significant implications. And ultimately, that is why I went on the path that I have at this point, going from studying the impact of the body's response to exercise and nutrition to actually looking at that and petri dishes and these model systems that replicate what humans do. And you can do these more novel and innovative strategies to ultimately applying these tools that we've studied early on and actually translating and understanding how they work in humans. And that's what we've been doing for, going on almost a decade now. So that's ultimately what led me here.
Well, did you run across Dr. Bernstein's work?
So what's interesting, Dr. Westman, is I did not come across Dr. Bernstein until about halfway through grad school. But the irony here is that I had actually come across something very similar to the Bernstein protocol inadvertently, and had done it a few years after my diagnosis. So when I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and it still is the case, they often tell you eat they hopefully will tell them, at least don't eat these processed foods, eat these whole food based, foods. And you do these things called carb counting, where you count the amount of carbs you consume and you give a proportional amount of insulin with it. Now we know that strategy does not work. The evidence says, based on meta-analysis, that carb counting does nothing on glycemic control, or does not help you improve glycemic control. But at the time, and still today, this is like the gold standard strategy for managing this disease, because ultimately it is not up for debate that when you consume carbohydrates, they raise your blood sugar and you will need insulin to bring it into a normal range. But I had actually found some time ago that I had come across something called the Atkins diet. Now, I was told, because I went from being this, obese adolescent child to then wanting to be the opposite of that, as big and as strong and as fast as I possibly could. And with being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, I become so interested about how everything I was consuming was affecting my body. So I used to track my macronutrients and then track my progress in the gym and weight and body composition, all these things over time. And for about 5 years, I was doing this, what is typically the gold standard approach in bodybuilding, which is you eat these high protein, whole food based strategies. And of course, I was very hyper focused, Dr. Westman. So I was able to achieve relatively in the sixes, which is, what is not normal by any means.
HbA or an A1C. The A1C.
Yes. Yeah, so what that means for your audience members who may be unfamiliar with A1C, it's an average of your blood sugar over a 2 to 3 month period of time, which is usually able to reflect or associate with certain average glucose levels. So the more glucose, the more in your system and circulation, the more that would stick to these with hemoglobin cells, and the more you have of that, the higher your blood sugar was. And so I was around, low to mid sixes on a regular basis, which is, most endocrinologists today would even be like, that's amazing, but it wasn't normal. And so I actually had heard of the Atkins diet because I was hyped as the ability at the time. I didn't know, I was ignorant at this stage. I had no idea of the ability to eat this way, hold muscle and lose fat. And I was like, okay, well, that sounds great if I'm trying to change my physique and improve my performance. So I actually shifted. And actually, it was interesting at the time, Dr. Westman, I had gotten a hold of a professional athlete who I knew had type 1 diabetes. And so I found their email and I reached out to them. And they ultimately got back to me and actually got on a phone with me. And they said that also happened to be a registered dietitian in their prior background. And I said, hey, look, I have type 1 diabetes. I'm really interested in kind of improving the, performance and how I feel and all these other things. It had nothing to do with glycemic control at the time, because it's not hyper focused when you go to the doctor. It's just like, hey, live your life and don't let diabetes affect your life. That's the philosophy that's still kind of put out there, which is understandable to a degree, but also fails to inform the patient that they need to be making decisions that will affect how they feel and will affect their life. And so at that time, I was a little bit, my locus of control was very internal. And I thought, I want to figure out what I can do to improve myself. And so over the time after they called me, I started communicating with them and actually worked with them. And they actually helped. And I said, look, I want to try this Atkins diet. I want to try, I heard it could really help me. And I said, well, okay, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but if you want to try it, here's how you do it. And they knew about regular insulin. They knew about the different strategies in the food. And they kind of gave me a master rapid course on how to do it. I'd never heard of Dr. Bernstein. And for your audience who's maybe not aware of Dr. Bernstein is a legendary figure in the type 1 diabetes community for writing essentially the handbook and guidebook on how to regulate glycemic control and insulin on a very low carbohydrate approach, which is what other people used to call the Atkins approach or a ketogenic diet. There's all these names that have been used over the years for that approach. But ultimately, I use the word Atkins just because that's how I got introduced to it. And what I did is 3 months later, after using the guidance of this individual, which is very similar to the Bernstein approach, very, very similar, had individualized kind of like a titration and methodology they were helping me on. And I go to my doctor 3 months later, who also happened to, Dr. Westman, be the American Diabetes Association president at the time. And I never knew, like, oh yeah, it's a kind of big irony, right? And I go in and I get my A1C values back, and he just looks at me and he goes, "What are you doing?" And I go, "What do you mean?" And he goes, "This is the best HbA1c I've ever seen in my office." And I go, and now I'm so empowered. I'm like, well, guess what? Here's what I'm doing, you know? And so I got all jazzed, because what I also found was it wasn't just that one metric. I actually started feeling better. You know, I found myself unlikely to go outside of feeling normal. You know, I felt very stable, and I would check my blood sugar because I didn't have a CGM at the time. I would this is outside of having any CGM or continuous glucose monitoring. This was just finger stick. And I would find that when I would check my finger stick, I'm like, okay, well, I'm not in the high 100s, 200s, like, or going low all the time. I'm just kind of always finding very consistent numbers in this range. You know, I just started to feel better. And ultimately, ironically, started to perform better in the gym too. At the time, I was probably not eating a diet that was consuming as much essential fatty acids as I probably should have at that time. So right when I switched, my strength went through the roof. And I also looked leaner, which, you know, at this time, this is all great for me. You know, I'm in my, late teens, early 20s, thinking, you know, this is all good stuff for me, without any intent, Dr. Westman, of improving my glycemic control. It just so happened that I walked in and my glycemic control was the best it had ever been in my entire life. And that's when it clicked to me. I said, man, there's something special about this. This is fascinating. Nutrition was able to completely revolutionize my meal-by-meal experience, my day-to-day experience, and ultimately completely change the course of my disease management, and ultimately my career path in life. And I haven't looked back since.
You know, are you in ketosis too when you eat this way?
So I actually recently did a case report published in American Journal of Physiology, AJP Cell Physiology, and Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, actually looking at myself, the first ever longitudinal report over 10 years of a person.
Watso et al.?
Yes. So Joe Watts was a friend of mine at Florida State University, and that's where I actually did my undergraduate and studied the impact of things like cardiovascular health and mental health at the time. And so that was what I originally did in research was cardiovascular implications of mental health status, and went on to study nutrition, and kind of all this came together for me, and actually focusing on disease, specifically diabetes. But so Watso et al., I reached out to him like, hey, you know, I've been on this diet for 10 years. And I had DEXAs from Florida State. I had blood work back then. I knew exactly what I was eating because as I told you, I was tracking everything, including insulin. So I was tracking insulin and food. So I knew exactly what I was eating. I knew my exercise routine. I knew everything. And I had been essentially doing that over the years. And so I'm like, we should do a follow-on report. There's all this discussion around the controversy of this diet in the context of type 1 diabetes. It is, there's all this concern about, okay, lipids will go high. What about your cardiovascular risk? What about hypoglycemia? If you don't eat carbs, you go low. And if you're eating a ketogenic diet, won't you have risk for DKA? And so we actually did a medical health history review. And so we pulled up medical records. We did a post report. So we had DEXA's pre and post. We had lipid values throughout. We had HbA1c throughout. And because CGMs weren't available at that time, we had a 60-day CGM assessment at the end. We did advanced lipids at the end, and essentially looked at early signs of what I thought was the most important thing we could do, was early signs of key adverse risks that were hypothesized, not just to occur in the context of a ketogenic diet and type 1 diabetes, but in general, in the general population. Because there had been all this risk, Dr. Westman, about, okay, well, your bone mineral density will go down on one of these diets, or, hey,
all this worry about,
yes. And so this,
so did you get the arteries checked, the carotid?
So
I send in a prescription.
Yeah, so here's what happened. So when we over that period of time, I had controlled my calories. I kept my body weight plus or minus 5% the entire time over a decade. I had adhered to a ketogenic diet and had confirmed elevated ketone bodies. And I knew essentially that I had almost complete control over that period of time, almost levels of control that almost never you'd see in a longitudinal report like this. And I had DEXA that confirmed this. So we had DEXA, bone mineral density, body composition, and we had a post, and it was near identical. Now, what we found is we wanted to do advanced assessment of measures of future atherosclerotic risk and present atherosclerotic risk. The reason that was so important was because not only do we want to assess safety and efficacy, but we really wanted to look, are there early signs of a deterioration of cardiovascular health? Because that's what people hypothesize would happen.
Well, but so in my clinic, and if those who have listened to me on the channel, I go to the direct measurement of the arteries now, because the predictive tool of looking at the blood just isn't good enough. So have you had the arteries checked?
So I've had a CT angio a calcium scan. I've had and during the, so it didn't make it in the report. So I'll tell you this. What we did is
I didn't see it in the report. That's why
it wasn't. I actually have it on my desk over here. So what happened was, I wish we would have included it. I literally did this about
how about an addendum? It's a new page. How about an
That's probably a good idea. I didn't know we could do that. Yeah. So maybe we'll actually submit that in, because it's highly relevant. I recently did get an angiogram and calcium score, and it was a total score of 0. So I am currently, so a major win. And the reason that's so important, as your audience will appreciate, I know you already know this, Dr. Westman, is that that's obviously the gold standard assessment of actually whether you have not early signs, but like progression of atherosclerotic disease. Now, we didn't actually anticipate that at the time. What we thought was, we know that within the context of type 1 diabetes, that you can see changes in how the vasculature responds to stress. That is the early sign of future progression of atherosclerosis. And this is looking at things like the stiffness of the arteries, the compliance of the arteries. And some people may be up for debate on this, but ultimately that's the focus we took. We looked at, see, is there any indication of these early signs, whether they were adverse? Because we know in the context of type 1 diabetes, these start to deteriorate even in kids within 4 years. Consistently, the weight of the evidence says that your ability to respond to vascular stress deteriorates, your stiffness of your arteries increases. But ultimately, that's what we focused on. But then later, after this report has come out, I did a calcium scan as well, and that came out to be 0, which is highly, highly relevant. Obviously, it's the gold standard of assessing true cardiovascular.
You always have to consider the context. So in the MESA study, if you're a carb eater and you have a calcium score of 0, the likelihood of a heart attack over the next 10 years is almost 0, right? So, but I mean, we hypothesize, it's our hunch that it will do even better by not being a carb eater. But that's excellent. So, it reminds me of 20 years ago, I had a visiting student, was a patient of Dr. Bernstein's, and I watched his LDL be really, really high. And I didn't know what to do 20 years ago. And in fact, I kind of said, I don't know that you should be doing this. In my first study, the randomized trial, we dropped someone because his LDL went up so high. And now 20 years later, we're following a group of people with high LDLs, not eating carbs, who looks like they don't get the vascular disease that they predict that they would get from just that LDL elevation. So, but that's awesome. It's kind of like if an alien came to Earth and there's just one alien, we'd study it up and down. We wouldn't dismiss it as an anecdote, right? So that's wonderful. I came across that paper. It was just August of this year. But what I really wanted to talk about is, what do ketones do, for heaven's sake? I mean, and with your experience on these papers for exercise, for cancer, for supplementations, I mean, let's switch gears now to what have you learned that practical take-home points. My patients ask me, should I get that keto? What is it now? A gummy, ketone gummy? Should I get the pills or the drinks? And so, from what your perspective right now, what have you learned about ketones? And
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and just any actionable things that we could learn from that.
Yeah, so we've been studying the application of either nutritionally induced, so through a diet, or through these tools called exogenous ketone bodies, because there are a number of ways to increase ketone bodies, but those are the two most reliable ways. And I worked in a lab with a gentleman I'm sure most of your audience is familiar with, named Dominic D'Agostino, where we were actually in the process of trying to develop novel new formulations of these ketone bodies, and then ultimately look at the signaling ramifications of their application in various settings, in disease and non-disease settings. And so a lot of the work in our lab originally started because there was an application of these exogenous ketone bodies or a ketogenic diet and its ability to potentially alter progression of cancer. So we use this very aggressive metastatic cancer model from something called a glioblastoma multiforme, which is one of the most aggressive forms of cancer that we know of. And we looked at the metastatic progression. So the model, not only was it this aggressive form of cancer, but it was also this aggressive form of cancer that we knew would rapidly metastasize. And so during grad school, one thing that I actually assessed was this form of cancer, but also the application of exogenous ketones throughout the post-administration of the cancer. So once you knew it was present, and then also the ramifications on various tissues, because we know some of the consequences that come with cancer are loss of muscle mass and other factors. And the short cliff notes of this to your audience is that we found during that not only did these exogenous ketones we saw statistically reduce the cancer burden in these animals, but also attenuated the loss of muscle mass in the animals. And we wrote multiple papers on this. And subsequent to this report, we've actually seen human clinical physiology studies where they will actually they've taken individuals into a clinic and induce these rapid forms of muscle wasting using using things like endotoxin and otherwise, like sleep deprivation, caloric deprivation, and then infusing ketone bodies, and see that you're actually able to preserve muscle mass turnover. So this work has since maturated into clinical studies, but these are some of the things we focused on originally. But since that work, it really has gone, has blown up in interest for a number of reasons in all these other domains, whether it be performance, both physical and cognitive, to neurological disorders, to potential and diabetes. And the reason that has happened is because when this was all coming to bear, not just the formulation of exogenous ketone bodies, because if you consider medium chain triglycerides, exogenous ketones, they've actually been clinically administering these since the 1950s for kids that had malabsorption disorders, and they worked. They were actually effective at helping these children over a half a century ago. But if you think about the more novel formulations, the reason people are now interested in this is because there's all this really, really well done signaling and mechanistic studies that have shown the ability for ketone bodies to attenuate inflammation, to attenuate oxidative stress by actually changing your epigenetic, what they call acetylation or methylation components. And so it has all these unique, not only metabolic effects by administering ketones just by themselves without a dietary change, but we also know that they have these signaling effects that would often be ascribed as positive effects. Reducing inflammation is often positive in most contexts, or reducing oxidative stress. These all seem like very positive things. And so now they've been administered in randomized controlled trials over a period of time to potentially improve cognitive decline, early cognitive decline, or other settings. And one thing that we studied over the years is their application, not only in disease model systems. So we talked about cancer, and we talked about muscle wasting as one context. We also looked at them in seizure context, and we found that they were able to attenuate seizures as well. But then I was actually leading a study that actually looked at the ability for ketone bodies, and this was just published 2 weeks ago, in military personnel, for their ability to actually alter brain energy metabolism and or attenuate the drop in cognitive performance that we see when you reduce oxygen availability. So basically, for those in the audience who are thinking, what is he talking about? Well, imagine you go up to altitude and you have reduced oxygen. You have something called hypoxia. Well, we know hypoxia reliably reduces cognition. And so what we wanted to understand in the military as well is, could you take military personnel and reduce the oxygen available to them, equivalent to going to the tip of Mount Kilimanjaro, almost like a snap of the fingers? And what happens when you do that at rest and when you do it with exercise? And what was fascinating, and this was just published 2 weeks ago, is that we're starting to appreciate that these molecules aren't just metabolites that are used for energy, and we know they have signaling to them. They change whole system physiology. So in this study, we administered them, exposed individuals to normal levels of oxygen, and then dramatically reduced the available oxygen to simulate super high altitudes at peak of some of the highest mountains in the world and induce hypoxia. And what we found is that individuals were able to retain higher levels of cognitive performance while on these molecules when exposed to oxygen deprivation. Because what would deprivation of oxygen do? Reduce the ability to have, ATP turnover, so to speak. And so we're able to improve cognition. But what was also fascinating, Dr. Westman, is that it also increased SpO2. This was not expected to happen. We had this very narrow focus of thinking. We've known that ketones may change neurological energy, brain energy metabolism since George Case's work in the 1960s. But here we are, almost a half a century late, or over a half a century later, and we thought, okay,
so explain what that means in layman's terms.
So when someone back in the 1960s, a group with George Cahill and Owen et al. Discovered that when you undergo chronic fasting, that you're able to supplement the brain energy needs, not just to be completely dependent on glucose. But that was when it was discovered that the brain can actually use things called ketone bodies. Now, the subsequent studies had come to find out that in the complete absence of nutrients, that these individuals were coherent and cognitively intact. But they also went on to discover that if you induced hypoglycemia in these individuals, they also retained cognitive capacity. Subsequent to that work, and so what that means is we know that, one, glucose is not the only fuel for the brain, but that ketones can also be a fuel. But there have been all these studies over the last couple of decades that have shown that it might be, one, a more efficient fuel, and two, maybe uptake in the brain in a dose-dependent manner. So the more that ketones available, the more your brain might actually utilize these nutrients. And when administering these molecules prior to basically inducing energetic deficits by lowering the available oxygen, again, through hypoxia, we found that these ketone bodies not only retained cognition at a higher level, but also appeared to increase the amount of oxygen the body was able to take in. So this was completely unexpected, and actually something that is subsequently been repeated. There was a recent paper that was published just this week after our work was published, showing that you can actually attenuate acute mountain sickness. So someone may be asking, what does it have to do with me? Maybe I'm dealing with obesity or type 2 diabetes, or I'm just trying to feel better and adapt your life, so to speak, to the theme of what you do. But this is relevant because what it's saying is that these molecules have profound effects on physiology that might improve not only your cognition and supplement your need for things like glucose in the brain, but also have very potent and rapid impacts of physiology that appear to translate to outside of the domain of just cognition but also to physiology and performance.
Well, the brainstorming that I've heard people do, actually, first I heard it was from Richard Veach years ago at the first ketone meeting or low-carb keto meeting. He got up and said in the front of the audience, when I have my heart attack, if I have one, I want to be infused with ketones. And I thought, this guy is nuts, but the idea is, I've heard that actually by other doctors saying, when you have a heart attack, take an aspirin, right? Try to reduce the platelet aggregation, the clotting, but to give a ketone when you have a threatened stroke, or a threatened heart attack or a traumatic brain injury. I've heard people say that you could be at the football field and run on the field, someone gets a concussion and give them ketones. I mean, so it's, in these conditions, you're running low on oxygen, low on fuel. If ketones could enhance that, what's the state of the art on those kinds of administrations under circumstances like a medical procedure or intervention? Is there anything in that regard?
That's a great question. So it's funny you mentioned that, because I actually was working on a project on that domain.
Okay.
So where we were as of 3 years ago was that we were just starting to appreciate, through work of people like Stephen Koutnik, who really took, the work of George Keto we're talking about to a whole nother level, where they were infusing ketone bodies, actually tracking their metabolism in the brain. And he was able to discover it appeared that your use of glucose in the brain appeared to be dependent on energy needs, but that the amount of ketones available seems to be utilized in a dose-dependent manner in the brain, essentially saying you could use as much as you have available to you. And then subsequent to that, he and others have worked to look and show that not only a ketogenic diet, but also exogenous ketone bodies could help age-related cognitive decline and or Alzheimer's-like conditions. But what about these other domains like concussions, traumatic brain injury, or when there's an insult in the brain of some respect, i.e. a stroke? So I actually studied stroke over 10 years ago, looking at the ramifications of things that could improve the vasculature in patients who already had a stroke. But this is a very interesting area, because in the context of concussion and traumatic brain injury, almost all the work has been in animals, and what up to about 3 years ago. And what that work had shown was, man, there appears to be these tremendous benefits to ketone bodies, or a la ketogenic diet, some way of inducing ketosis on these various forms of neurological injury. And be acute. If you consider stroke a neurological injury in a hemorrhagic or ischemic sense as well, if you bunch it in that category. And all the animal data was remarkably positive. It was showing the ability to resolve the insult to the brain quicker, that you reduce things like inflammation, and you would ultimately come back to show signs of recovery quicker. But there was almost nothing in the context of humans at that stage. And the human work had really underdosed individuals. So they were giving things like MCTs at doses that I would never consider to be meaningful. And so we really had nothing. But I was actually involved in a study that was actually looking, I initially involved in a study at the time, although I wasn't a part of the final completion of it, trying to understand how they could be applied in the context of traumatic brain injury. And a lot of that work was very interested in the acute application, because what happens is we don't yet know is the truth of if and when we should apply them in these contexts. All the data to date says that if you had to choose, let me just use my own example. If I were to be diagnosed with a concussion or a traumatic brain injury, the data says to me today that I would want to apply them rapidly to reduce the potential for inflammation, oxidative stress, and to supplement brain energy needs, because we know that glucose metabolism acutely in these neurological assaults is completely dysregulated. So what that means for the average audience member or a layman who may be unfamiliar with these medical terminology, it means that your ability to metabolize what is the primary fuel on a standard high carb diet is dramatically impaired in inflammatory conditions in the brain, i.e. a concussion, i.e. traumatic brain injury or stroke. So supplementing it with something that may be more efficient, that doesn't appear to be impaired by these inflammatory conditions, because most of the evidence is suggesting that in these age-related conditions where there's chronic inflammation, you apply ketone bodies and they appear to be metabolized very efficiently and not impaired by these issues like inflammation or chronic inflammation that come along with age-related disorders. And so right now, I would feel confident saying that in the absence of evidence, that I feel the weight of the evidence we do have would suggest that it would be an incredibly powerful tool to apply in these domains. But we don't yet have the evidence to say with these randomized controlled trials, hey, we know it is effective in this domain. Yet we don't have that, but we do have a lot of encouraging evidence that says, if you had to make a choice, I would personally be making a choice to apply them but it's up to each to figure that out, and we'll see what the evidence says.
It sounds like Dr. Veach still could be exonerated at some point. Infused me with ketones. He said, well, switching gears again. I mean, you're into so much. It's so great. Exercise. So we were taught, and I think textbooks still say, that when you get to a certain level of anaerobic activity, sprinting and all this, your body has to use glucose. And I remember Professor Noakes recently, relatively recently, probably some years ago now, he's the person who taught people how to run marathons in his book, The Lore of Running, in Cape Town, South Africa. Now the major editor on the textbook Ketogenic. And then Jeff Volek doing work with exercise, saying that the body might be able to sprint, the muscle might be able to use fatty acids or ketones when it was thought that it couldn't. What's the latest on the idea that your muscles can use fat and ketones and glucose, and what's the current thinking there?
So it must be, it's important to always tell the audience where we were, because what we've shown here, I think, really upends our prior assumptions. What we have always believed in the field of exercise physiology was that as exercise intensity increases, so let's say you're sitting down, then you go for a walk. Then you start doing a light, fast-paced walk, to a subtle jog, to a hard jog, to a sprint. This is the spectrum by which intensity can increase over time. And it was believed that as intensity increased, you shift your energetic needs from very low carbohydrate needs at these low intensities, but very high fat needs at low intensities, to where you hit this, what's called the crossover effect, where there's a crossover point by which the amount of carbohydrates rapidly, or the ability to utilize fat rapidly diminishes, and carbohydrates rapidly increases as exercise intensity increases. And the thought around this was that there was this oxygen deprivation when you get to like sprints, where you have to use glycolytic metabolism, because glucose can go to things like lactate in the absence of oxygen, whereas fat needs to be metabolized and turned to ATP. You need oxygen available. Well, we challenged that, because the question was, well, it was always believed that if you want to do a sprint-based protocol, or you want to run extremely fast for short durations of time, that you always need carbs. Like, carbs are that essential fuel. And the philosophy of this goes back decades, Dr. Westman, decades. But we thought, let's actually ask the question, because all the studies to date had really focused on less than 4 weeks in duration. So this period of time where the body, and that's critical, because we have known for a period of time that performance does initially drop off, maybe not substantially, but initially when you go on these type of low carbohydrate ketogenic diet strategies, as your body is adapting to the new dietary and energy needs. But what happens at the 4 week mark? Because there was this hypothesis that at 4 weeks, you kind of flip the switch, so to speak. And we know that it's happening sooner. There's a number of changes that happen almost instantly. The first meal, you reduce carbohydrates, your insulin's lower, your glucose influx in the bloodstream's lower. You start seeing ketones at the 18-hour mark from 0 to 0.3. And then your whole body oxidation of certain fuel starts to change within the first couple weeks. So, but why 4 weeks? Well, there was this thinking like, well, you see all these changes before that. So if you're on a ketogenic diet for 3 weeks, that's sufficient time to determine whether you have performance or not. Well, all these studies, Eric, were showing that if you get to 3 weeks and you're an elite athlete and you do this diet, you're going to have impaired performance. So everyone thought, okay, obviously carbs are essential for fuel. You're going to impair performance. However, if you actually looked at the weight of the evidence on performance and looked at the low carb or ketogenic diet strategies, you would see that once you're only looking at studies that are at least 4 weeks in duration or longer, the evidence wasn't supporting this philosophy that you needed these high carb diets to perform well. And so what we did is we challenged that assumption. We actually took athletes, high level athletes, and they were lean, were running over 50 kilometers per week, that were actually, many of which were competing, and high VO2 maxes in middle age. Okay, so they were experienced athletes. And we said, what happens if the same person in a randomized controlled fashion controls their body composition, their calories, and their physical activity for the whole duration? And they go on this high carb diet for 4 weeks and then take a break. And then they go on the low carb ketogenic diet for 4 weeks. And then they do this very, very highly demanding, short duration, high intense exercise of running a mile as fast as you can run it, or doing 6 by 800 meter sprints. Number one, we found that there was no difference in performance in the same person if they adhere to the diet for at least 4 weeks in duration, while controlling all the confounding variables we know could interfere with our interpretation of whether the diet is actually causing the effect. So we'd really tried to isolate out here, Eric, is the diet causing any negative effect on performance? And what we found is when we control these other confounders, and we did it for 4 weeks, no, even in these high intense exercise bouts. But what we also found is that we showed that even at the highest levels of when this crossover effect, around 60% of your VO2 max, maybe up to 70%, you would expect that the amount of fat you're oxidizing goes dramatically down, and the amount of carbs you're oxidizing goes dramatically up. But what we found is these individuals that had adhered to the diet for 4 weeks and doing these super high intense exercise bouts, that they were oxidizing levels of fat that had never been recorded before, and at north of 85% of their VO2 max. So what does that mean to the average person listening to this? It means that not only when they went on a low carbohydrate diet, it didn't impair performance, despite it being very intense forms of performance. But number two, the way in which they appeared to maintain their performance was actually oxidizing fats at exercise intensity levels that we would predict you could never actually see any meaningful level of fat oxidation. And so we actually saw record levels of fat oxidation. So oftentimes in science, we make assumptions based on prior evidence, because that's what we do. We have to make assumptions based on the best evidence we have available. But what we did here, Eric, is we actually tested the question itself and found that the assumptions were wrong. That if you could actually do a low carbohydrate diet, ketogenic diet, and still perform analogously in these very intense bouts. But what was also interesting, and I think highly relevant to your audience, is that when the individuals, same individuals at middle age, all fit, all normal body, in fact, actually super fit in body composition, high VO2 maxes, 30% of these individuals who are on the high carbohydrate approach were showing glycemic values consistent with prediabetes. So we did not anticipate this, because when they came in, they were all healthy, non-diagnosed individuals. But when we actually put a continuous glucose monitor on them, and it wasn't just a one glucose monitor, we actually had multiple continuous glucose monitors. We controlled based on batching. We also did analogous testing to confirm that it wasn't just over a short period of time. We actually looked at fasting first 24 hour. And so this was over a 31-day average. This wasn't a single snapshot. Like you go to a doctor and you get an HbA1c, a fasting plasma glucose value, or oral glucose tolerance test. That is an individual snapshot of a single time point of your metabolic status. Whereas a continuous glucose monitor can give you potential insights over, honestly, 240-fold times that within a single day, and tens of thousands of times that over a month. And we took the average of those composite values of glucose and found that 30% were on high carb diets were showing values consistent with prediabetes. And those individuals were able to resolve their pre-diabetic glycemic values when they were on the low carbohydrate diet strategy. So this did two things. One, it upended this idea of the dogma that high carb was essential, and you had to have it, especially at high intensities. We found that was not true in this case. We also found that there was this philosophy of you can get away with anything if you exercise and you're lean and healthy. Well, what we were seeing was that individuals were developing early signs of what appeared to be adverse metabolic health status through glycemic values when you actually use advanced testing that wouldn't normally pick it up through one of these single snapshots when they were eating a high carb diet. And what that told us is that, okay, if you had to choose and you can perform the same on either diet, maybe it's not so much about performance anymore for the average person, for 99% of people out there. Maybe there's a health related question for athletes that they have to consider when they make a dietary choice. it's not just about performance.
Right. Well, that I think was Peter Attia's experience. As he was a swimmer, and he developed in the video that he did at Human and Computer Cognition, which is a great teaching video. I still use it with my students and residents. He was able to swim back and forth the Maui Channel, but he said his belly looked as big as his wife's, and his wife was pregnant. And so that's a wonderful video to watch. It goes through his understanding of how he got into it, and then the biochemistry behind it, and then ends up saying, we biked all of the peaks of Colorado, and here I am, and he's at the top holding his bike up high, and he felt like he did it with less exertion because of the idea that you'd have more oxygen and all that. So anyway, yeah, he's evolved in his thinking since then, but it was a brilliant snapshot in his time. By the way, are you there at that institute still?
Which one?
The Human and Machine Cognition.
So I'm a visiting research scientist at the Florida Institute of Human and Machine Cognition. I'm not involved in active projects with them right now, but I do retain a position with them at a visiting capacity.
Okay. The thought occurred to me. I interviewed Stephen Cunnane recently, and do you know French, or could you learn really quickly?
French, no.
Could you learn quickly, and then you could go up and be the professor of ketone therapeutics at Cherbourg?
If I learn a new language as fast as my wife, it'd be no problem, Eric. It'd be done instantly.
Well, maybe if it's a couple, he says he needs someone who's francophone, or can French, but or just a little Duolingo for a while. Anyway, it's the only endowed chair I'm aware of that is specific for ketone therapeutics, in the world. So, I don't want to keep you any longer, and I thank you so much for sharing this really important information. And just for those watching, I mean, you're at a point of watching the science, in animals, and then humans, and ketones, and MCT, and all and then it affects every part of the body. The metabolism is so different. I wish you all the best, and thank you for the work that you're doing. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. And I appreciate the legacy of the effect you've had on the entire field, and what you've done over time. And I encourage everyone to stay tuned. I can promise you some of what we spoke about here today. We have some more stuff coming on this front that I think that addresses everything we've hit, each component, both diabetes and performance and beyond, that I think is going to be quite revolutionary, I believe, in how we view not only disease management, but also performance applications when it comes to these dietary strategies. So stay tuned. How do people find you, or where can they get the latest on what you're doing? Yeah, so I have a website, Andrew Koutnik, AndrewKoutnik.com. I'm going to keep that'll be updated here soon with more of this information, and keep people more informed, largely free-based information to help individuals. And I do stay active on Twitter and Instagram. I just made a TikTok. So I'm A Koutnik, AKOUTNIK on Twitter X. I'm Andrew Koutnik, PhD on Instagram and on TikTok. I'm sure if you search Andrew Koutnik, you'll find me. I don't actually know my handle. I think it's the same as my Instagrams, but I'm trying to ultimately translate as much of the information as that we have and we study to actually impact people in a positive way. So if you stay tuned, you'll hopefully get a lot of useful information. And thanks for sharing your own personal experience. And it goes beyond the normal, what I ask folks. I really appreciate that. And keep up the great work. Thank you so much, Dr. Westman. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.